Dr. Kim Hanna gripped the transport shuttle safety rail as the vessel descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere. Through the viewport, she watched the Zephyrin Academy grow larger below them. The entire structure seemed made of living crystal, its towers and walkways gleaming like precious gems under the twin suns. Everything looked so delicate, so beautiful, and so utterly alien. The shuttle landed with barely a whisper on the Academy's main platform. Hannah gathered her belongings and stepped out, immediately feeling the lighter gravity of this world. Each step felt like she might bounce too high, so she moved carefully, aware that dozens of alien eyes were watching her every movement. A group of faculty members waited to greet her. At their head stood Dean Veltaris, the tallest being she had ever seen. His skin was like frosted glass, and she could actually see his bones underneath. Thin, hollow structures that reminded her of bird bones back on Earth. When he moved, it was with the careful grace of someone who knew that a single wrong step could shatter everything. "Professor Kim," the dean said, his voice coming through a small translation device attached to his throat. "Welcome to our institution. We are curious about human teaching methods." Hannah caught the slight pause before curious. It was the same tone her old professors used when they had to be polite about something they did not really want to deal with. She looked around at the other faculty members, insect-like creatures with multiple arms clicking their sharp mouths together, floating clouds of colored gas that shifted from blue to green, and more Zephyrians like the dean, all watching with what felt like barely hidden doubt. "I'm honored to be here," Hannah said, giving a small bow like she'd been taught in diplomacy training. The reaction was immediate. Every Zephyrian within sight took a step backward, their glass-like faces showing alarm. Even her simple bow seemed to frighten them. Hannah straightened quickly, making a mental note to move even more carefully than she had planned. "Yes, well," Dean Veltari said, his voice tight, "let me show you to your quarters." They walked through corridors that looked like the inside of a geode. The walls curved smoothly overhead, covering crystals that gave off their own soft light. Everything was beautiful, but Hannah noticed how thin the walls were, how delicate the doorways appeared. She found herself pulling her elbows in close to her body, afraid that her normal human movements might accidentally damage something. Her quarters were larger than she had expected, with a view of the Academy gardens where strange plants grew in geometric patterns. The furniture was elegant, but clearly designed for beings much lighter than humans. She sat carefully on what she hoped was a chair, and it creaked ominously under her weight. Dean Veltaris handed her a data tablet. "Your teaching schedule, Professor Kim. You'll be instructing basic physics to mixed species classes." Hannah looked at the schedule, then at the course description at the bottom of the screen. Her eyes widened as she read. "Fundamental force interactions for primitive civilizations." The words hit her like a slap. Primitive civilizations. That was how they saw humanity, as barely advanced enough to be worth teaching. "I see," she said, keeping her voice level. "Basic physics." "Nothing too complex," the dean assured her, apparently not noticing her reaction. "These students have already mastered anti-gravity manipulation and faster-than-light mathematics. But we thought it might be educational for them to see how less advanced species approach these concepts." After the dean left, Hannah sat alone in her crystalline room, surrounded by boxes of demonstration materials she had brought from Earth. Simple things, wooden blocks, metal balls, spring-loaded devices, and measuring tools. Back home, these were standard physics classroom equipment. Here, they probably looked like Stone Age artifacts. She picked up one of the wooden blocks, turning it over in her hands. It was solid oak, heavy and dense. She had planned to use it for demonstrations about mass and inertia. Now she wondered if these delicate alien students would even be able to lift it. Through her window, she watched Zephyrian students moving through the gardens. They seemed to float more than walk, their movements so light and careful that they barely disturbed the geometric plants around them. She saw Chithari students as well, their insect-like bodies moving with precise, calculated steps, and the gaseous nebulans drifting like living clouds between the crystal formations. All of them moved like they were afraid of breaking something. Or maybe, Hannah realized with growing understanding, they moved like they were afraid of being broken. She had come here thinking she would learn from these advanced civilizations. She had expected to be the student, absorbing knowledge from species that had mastered technologies humans could barely imagine. Instead, she was supposed to teach basic concepts to beings who considered her species primitive. But as she watched the alien students through her window, moving so carefully through their perfect crystal world, Hannah began to wonder if there were things about physics that could only be learned by creatures who had grown up in a world where breaking things was possible, where force and impact were daily realities instead of theoretical concepts. Tomorrow, she would meet her first class. Tomorrow, she would find out exactly what these advanced civilizations thought about human understanding of the physical world. 3 weeks had passed since Professor Kim Hannah first walked into the Zephyrian Academy, and she was beginning to understand just how different her new students were from any she had taught before. The lecture hall filled with sounds that no human ear was meant to hear. Soft musical chimes from the Zephyrian students as they communicated, rapid clicking and chittering from the insect-like chitheri, and the strange whooshing noise that the gaseous Nebulan students made when they spoke to each other. Hannah stood at the front of the classroom, looking out at faces that ranged from crystalline and transparent to compound-eyed and multi-mandible. Her teaching assistant, Lee Miho, had arrived from Earth just 1 week ago, and she could see him still adjusting to the strangeness of it all. He moved carefully around the demonstration table, arranging the simple tools they had brought from home, wooden blocks, metal balls, springs, and measuring devices. For 3 weeks, Hannah had tried to teach these students about basic physics. She had explained Newton's laws, talked about force and motion, and demonstrated simple mechanical principles. But every lesson felt like she was speaking to a wall of polite boredom. These students lived in a world where their transportation pods could fly without wings, where their buildings floated in the air without support, and where they could communicate across vast distances instantly without any visible technology. To them, learning about momentum and inertia was like asking a computer programmer to learn how to count on their fingers. They could not understand why anyone would need such primitive knowledge when they had machines that could do impossible things. Student Zuaxtala, a young Zephyrian who sat in the front row, raised what Hannah had learned to call a hand, though it looked more like a crystal sculpture than anything human. "Professor Kim," she said through her translator, "surely these concepts are elementary? Our transportation pods demonstrate momentum transfer without classical mechanical limitations." Hannah had been expecting this question for weeks. She smiled, trying to hide her frustration. "That's exactly why we need to understand the fundamentals. Your advanced technology works so well that you've forgotten the underlying principles." She walked over to the demonstration table and picked up one of the wooden blocks. It was a simple piece of oak, about the size of a brick, heavy and solid in her hands. As she lifted it, she noticed something interesting. Several of her students leaned backward in their seats, as if the wooden block was somehow dangerous just by being handled. "Today, we'll explore force, mass, and acceleration through direct demonstration," Hannah announced. "I need volunteers." The response was not encouraging. A few Chithri students raised their arms, all 4 of them, which was their way of showing interest, but their exoskeletons made nervous clicking sounds. The Zephyrian students remained perfectly still in their seats, their transparent bodies seeming even more fragile than usual. The Nebulan students just shifted colors, slightly, which Miho had told her meant they were uncomfortable. "Let's start simple," Hannah said, placing the wooden block on the demonstration table with what she thought was a gentle motion. Even that small action caused a few students to flinch. "Can someone show me how your species would move this block?" Student Vexalor, one of the braver Zephyrians, stood up slowly from his seat. His movements were so careful and controlled that he seemed to be dancing rather than walking. When he reached the demonstration table, he extended one crystalline finger toward the wooden block, approaching it like it might explode at any moment. He touched the block with the very tip of his finger and gave it the gentlest possible push. The block moved perhaps 1 centimeter across the table's surface before stopping. "Excellent," Hannah said, though she was trying to process what she had just seen. "Now, what if we needed to move it further? Or faster?" Vexalor looked at her with confusion written across his transparent features. "Professor Kim, this is the maximum safe force application for solid matter interaction. To exceed this would risk structural damage to both the object and the operator." Hannah blinked. "Structural damage?" The compression wave generated by excessive force application could cause catastrophic resonance failure in crystalline bone structures, explained another Zephyrian student. Basic safety protocols prevent force levels above 0.3 newtons for direct physical interaction. Miho leaned over to whisper in her ear. Professor, I think they're saying they can't push any harder than that without hurting themselves. Hannah looked around the classroom with new understanding. These students were not just being careful or polite. They literally could not apply more force than the gentle touch she had just witnessed. Their bodies were too delicate, too fragile for what humans would consider normal physical interaction. What about lifting the block? She asked. Could someone pick it up? The silence that followed was telling. Finally, one of the Chithari students spoke up. Professor Kim, our species' maximum safe lifting capacity is approximately 2.7 kilograms under optimal conditions. That wooden block appears to exceed safe handling parameters. Hannah looked down at the block in her hands. It weighed maybe 5 kilograms, about 11 pounds. On Earth, a child could lift it easily. Here, it was apparently too heavy for any of her students to safely handle. She was beginning to realize that this demonstration might reveal more than she had planned. Professor Kim Hannah wrote the familiar equation on the holographic display that floated above her desk. The glowing letters hung in the air. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. It was one of the most basic laws of physics, something every human student learned in high school. But as she looked out at her classroom full of alien faces, she realized that these students had never truly experienced what this equation meant in the real world. Understanding the formula isn't the same as experiencing its practical application, she explained, turning away from the floating display. Today, we're going to feel physics in action. Her teaching assistant, Park Jahun, had set up a demonstration at the front of the classroom. He held one end of the thick wooden board steady, while the other end rested on a support stand, creating a bridge between 2 points. The board was about 3 centimeters thick, made of solid hardwood that Hannah had specially requested from the Academy's workshop. The students watched with their usual mix of polite attention and barely hidden boredom. The Zephyrians sat perfectly still, their crystalline bodies catching and reflecting the light from the holographic display. The Chithari students clicked their mandibles softly, which Hannah had learned was their equivalent of taking notes. The gaseous Nebulan students shifted through various shades of blue and purple, indicating mild interest. In human martial arts, Hannah continued, walking over to stand beside the wooden board, we learn to focus force into precise applications. It's a simple demonstration of physics principles that humans have been studying for thousands of years. She positioned herself next to the board and raised her right hand. The motion was smooth and controlled, something she had done countless times in her Taekwondo classes back on Earth. But as she lifted her arm, she noticed something strange happening in the classroom. Several Zephyrian students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their transparent bodies seeming to shrink back from her. Even this simple preparatory movement appeared to make them nervous. One student actually made a small sound like wind chimes in a storm. The key is proper form breath control and understanding exactly where to apply the force for maximum. Hannah brought her hand down in a sharp, controlled strike. Crack! The wooden board split cleanly in half with a sound like thunder in the quiet classroom. The 2 pieces clattered to the floor, bouncing once before coming to rest at her feet. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the echo of the breaking wood. Then absolute silence fell like a heavy blanket over everything. Hannah looked up from the broken board to see a classroom full of faces frozen in what could only be described as shock and terror. Student Kithyara, a young Zephyrian in the second row, was actually vibrating, her entire crystalline body producing a high-pitched humming sound that filled the air like a tuning fork struck too hard. 2 of the Chithari students had somehow moved to the back wall of the classroom without her noticing, pressing their armored bodies against the crystal surface as if trying to get as far away from her as possible. Their compound eyes were fixed on her with the kind of stare usually reserved for natural disasters or deadly predators. The Nebulan students had changed to a color Hannah had never seen before, a deep, dark red that pulsed like a warning light. That's impossible, whispered Vexalor, the same student who had barely been able to push the wooden block a centimeter the week before. His translucent skin had gone completely pale, making him look like a ghost. Professor Kim, what technology did you use? Hidden plasma cutters? Molecular destabilizers? Some kind of sonic weapon? Hannah looked down at her perfectly ordinary human hand, then at the 2 pieces of broken wood on the floor. Her hand didn't even hurt. The strike had been clean and controlled, exactly the way she had been taught years ago in her martial arts classes. No technology, she said slowly, beginning to realize that something was very wrong with the situation. Just physics. Just physics. Student Zuaxthala stood up from her seat, but her legs were shaking so badly she had to hold onto her desk for support. Professor, that material requires industrial-grade cutting tools to breach. Our safety protocols exist specifically because such force levels are considered destructive to station integrity. Park Jahun, who had been holding the other end of the board, stared at her with wide eyes. Professor, he whispered in Korean, I think we made a mistake. Another Zephyrian student, whose name Hannah couldn't remember, spoke up in a voice that trembled with fear. The structural analysis of that wooden composite indicated a breaking strength of over 800 pounds per square inch. No biological entity in the galactic database can generate sufficient force to cause such damage without mechanical assistance. Hannah felt a cold realization washing over her like ice water. She looked around the classroom at faces filled with terror and disbelief. These students weren't just surprised by her demonstration. They were frightened of her, of what she had just done with nothing more than her bare hand. How? How strong are humans? Asked Katyara, her crystalline voice barely audible above her own vibrating body. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Hannah began to understand that the differences between humans and the rest of galactic civilization might be far greater than anyone had imagined. Within 3 hours of the wooden board incident, Professor Kim Hannah found herself sitting on a strange examination table in the Academy's medical research wing. The room buzzed with activity as alien scientists moved around her with instruments she had never seen before. Beams of colored light scanned her body from head to toe, while screens displayed information in languages she could not read. Dr. Thexmeron, a tall Zephyrian with skin like polished glass, stood at the main control panel. His crystalline fingers moved rapidly over the holographic displays, and his transparent face showed an expression that could only be described as amazement mixed with fear. Remarkable, he whispered to himself, though his translation device made sure everyone in the room could understand. Bone density 3 times the galactic average. Muscle fiber composition, unlike anything in our databases. Neural pathway efficiency that suggests combat-ready reflexes at all times. Hannah shifted uncomfortably on the examination table, which creaked under her weight despite being made from the same crystal material as everything else in the academy. Is this really necessary? I just broke a piece of wood. Dr. Qixandra, a Chithri researcher with 4 arms and compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once, made a rapid clicking sound with her mandibles. Hannah had learned that this was how her species laughed when they were nervous. Professor Kim, Dr. Qixandra said, her voice coming through a translator attached to her throat. Are all humans capable of such destructive output? Destructive? Hannah looked around the room at the faces staring at her. Some were crystalline and transparent like the Zephyrians. Others were insect-like with multiple eyes, and a few belonged to species she had never seen before. All of them looked at her with the same expression, like she was some kind of dangerous weapon that had accidentally been brought into their peaceful world. Breaking a wooden board is basic martial arts, she said slowly. Children on Earth learn this. It's not destructive, it's just normal. The silence that followed her words was so complete that she could hear the humming of the medical equipment around her. Dr. Thexmeron's crystalline body actually trembled slightly, making a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Park Jahun, her teaching assistant, sat on another examination table across the room. He had been subjected to the same tests she had, and his face showed the same confusion she felt. They've been running simulations, Professor, he said quietly in Korean, then switched to English so the others could understand. According to their models, what you did should have required machinery. Dr. Velkaroth, a massive creature that looked like it was made of living stone, lumbered forward carrying a data tablet in hands the size of dinner plates. Despite his enormous size, his movements were surprisingly gentle, as if he was afraid he might accidentally step on someone. "Human Kim," he said in a voice like distant thunder, "we have analyzed your homeworld specifications." He held up the data tablet, so she could see the scrolling information. Gravity 2.3 times galactic standard. Atmospheric pressure, requiring constant muscular compensation. Predatory ecosystem necessitating rapid defensive responses. Hannah looked at the data, seeing Earth described in terms she had never considered before. The gravity that felt normal to her was more than twice what these beings considered safe. The air pressure that she breathed without thinking would crush the delicate bone structures of most galactic species. The plants and animals she had grown up with were apparently so dangerous that they would be classified as weapons on most civilized worlds. "You evolved in a death world," Dr. Thexmeron stated, his voice flat and emotionless. "Your species developed under conditions that would kill most sentient beings within days." The research team looked at each other with expressions that Hannah was beginning to understand carried much more meaning than she had realized. These were not just curious scientists studying an interesting specimen. These were beings trying to figure out if humanity represented a threat to galactic civilization. Dr. Qyxandra approached her table carefully, staying just out of arm's reach. "Professor," she asked, and Hannah could hear the fear in her artificial voice, "when humans interact with other species, do you hold back?" The question hit Hannah like a physical blow. She thought about every interaction she had had since arriving at the academy. Every handshake with Zephyrian colleagues where she had consciously controlled her grip strength. Every careful movement around the delicate crystal architecture. Every time she had walked slowly and gently to avoid frightening her students. Every conscious effort to appear small and non-threatening. "Always," she admitted, and the words seemed to echo in the quiet room. "We learned early in first contact that we had to be gentle. We assumed it was cultural sensitivity. It was survival," Dr. Velkaroth rumbled softly. "You have been unconsciously restraining yourselves to prevent accidentally killing your new allies." The weight of this revelation settled over Hannah like a heavy blanket. For the first time, she understood why her students had been so frightened by her simple demonstration. To them, watching a human break a wooden board with their bare hands was like watching someone casually destroy a piece of industrial equipment without any tools. Humanity had not been welcomed into galactic society because they were impressive or advanced. They had been tolerated because they had proven they could control their own dangerous nature. 6 months had passed since the wooden board incident that changed everything. Professor Kim Hannah now stood in the most important building in the galaxy, the great amphitheater of Nexus Prime, where the Galactic Academic Council made decisions that affected billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. The amphitheater was enormous, its crystalline walls rising so high that the ceiling disappeared into misty shadows above. Seats arranged in perfect circles held representatives from 47 different species, each one focused entirely on her as she stood at the center speaking platform. The universal translation system carried her words to every corner of the vast hall, ensuring that beings who communicated through color changes, musical tones, and chemical signals could all understand what she was saying. Hannah took a deep breath and began her presentation. "The Human Educational Exchange Program requires immediate restructuring," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Not because humans lack academic capability, but because we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of interspecies interaction." A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates. She could see Zephyrians in their transparent beauty, Chithri with their multiple arms gesturing in complex patterns, gaseous nebulans shifting through worried colors, and dozens of other species she was still learning to identify. All of them looked concerned. Council leader Zarthek spoke from the highest tier of seats. He was an ethereal, one of the oldest and most respected beings in galactic civilization. His body seemed to be made of living energy that constantly shifted between solid matter and pure light. When he spoke, his voice filled the entire amphitheater like distant thunder rolling across mountains. "Professor Kim," he said, and even through the translation system, she could hear the weight of centuries in his words. "Your research has created considerable concern throughout our civilization." Hannah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. In the 6 months since her demonstration, word had spread throughout the galaxy about human physical capabilities. Some species had called for humanity to be banned from all academic institutions. Others had suggested that humans should be classified as a warrior race and restricted to military roles. A few extremist groups had even demanded that all humans be quarantined on Earth for the safety of galactic civilization. Concern is natural but unnecessary, Hannah replied, looking up at the council leader's shifting form. Humans have been practicing restraint intuitively since first contact. We adapted our behavior because we recognized the physical differences between our species. Behind her, a massive holographic display activated, showing comparative data that had taken months to compile. The numbers were staggering. Human bone density compared to galactic averages, muscle strength measurements, reaction times, sensory capabilities. Every statistic showed humans operating at levels that most species considered impossible for biological entities. What we initially interpreted as human aggression or primitive behavior, Hannah continued, was actually an unconscious protective response. Humans have been consciously limiting their physical expressions to avoid causing harm. From the human delegation section, Dr. Cho Yuna stood up. She had been one of Hannah's brightest students before being promoted to coordinate the new human exchange programs. The revised protocols we're proposing include mandatory restraint training for all human participants, clearly defined interaction guidelines, and specialized facilities designed to accommodate human physical requirements. The protocols have been Hannah's idea, developed after months of research and consultation with xenobiologists throughout the galaxy. Every human who wanted to participate in interspecies education would receive training on how to interact safely with delicate alien physiology. Special buildings would be constructed with reinforced materials that could handle human strength levels. Exercise facilities would be built so humans could maintain their physical health without accidentally damaging galactic infrastructure. Council member Veltaris, her old dean from the Zephyrin Academy, rose from his seat. His crystalline form caught the light from the holographic displays, creating rainbow patterns on the amphitheater walls. "You're asking us to redesign our civilization around your species' capabilities," he observed, and Hannah could hear both respect and concern in his translated voice. "No," Hannah replied firmly, looking directly at the Zephyrian who had first welcomed her to galactic academia. "We're asking you to acknowledge that diversity of evolutionary paths creates diversity of abilities. Humans offer unique perspectives precisely because we developed under different conditions." She gestured to the data, still scrolling behind her. Every species in this council chamber evolved differently. The Zephyrians developed crystalline structures that allow for perfect harmonic communication. The Chithari created exoskeletons that can interface directly with technology. The Nebulans learned to exist in multiple states of matter simultaneously. Each evolutionary path created unique abilities. Humans evolved on a world with high gravity, dangerous predators, and extreme environmental challenges, she continued. Our abilities reflect those conditions, but we also evolved cooperation, empathy, and the ability to recognize when our strength needs to be controlled. The voting process took 3 hours. Representatives debated in languages that sounded like music, chemical reactions, and electromagnetic pulses. Some species argued that humans were too dangerous. Others countered that humanity's proven restraint made them ideal protectors for more fragile civilizations. When the final vote was announced, it was closer than Hannah had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. The human galactic academic exchange would continue, but with new frameworks that recognized humanity's unique role. As she left the amphitheater, Hannah reflected on how much had changed since that first day when she broke a wooden board in a physics classroom. She had come to teach basic science to advanced civilizations. Instead, she had taught the galaxy that true strength meant knowing when not to use it.